everybody, it's Dot. So some folks wanted me to push part of the lesson into an online format, and so I'm going to provide the information. I really encourage you to try this activity, and I'd love to see what you come up with. If you do write something up, I would love it if you could send it to me because I will use it as part of the teaching next week with the in vivo and so on. So starting with this design map that we've been using, I created a sort of pretend study. So let me see if I can zoom in here for you. So, oops. Am I going to zoom? Thank you. Okay. So the goals, I want to understand how language use in high school mathematics contributes to academic identity and construction among students, period. Whoops. I want to understand how language processes unfold in culturally responsive mathematics instruction. Okay, so I'm viewing this phenomenon through the lens of positioning theory, and this is a theory that I often use. The sort of shorthand for positioning theory is this idea that in social interaction, we sort of have always these three pieces at play. So speech acts and other acts. It usually focuses a lot on speech acts. So that means people saying stuff. The storyline is kind of a funny term in a way. It means our understanding of the activity. Like what are we up to? What are we on about? Whether it's we're cooking dinner together and everyone's contributing, or mom's making dinner for everybody, or we're doing reading lesson that doesn't have anything to do with real reading, or we're engaging with books as like real readers. So that's storyline. And position is about these sort of temporary and fluid identities that over time can layer on top of each other. Kevin Leander uses this idea of lamination. They kind of laminate over time to into like a more stable identity. But I can open a position for you as a capable student, as an unprepared student, as a colleague, as a fashionista, and you can make moves that either step into or don't choose to step into that position. But the power dynamic between us is going to affect like what positions I open for you, and the sort of the level of coercion with which you wind up kind of in there. So I think about this a lot with my teacher candidates, and thinking about how everything we say and do in a classroom tells children something about who they are and who they can be in this space and what we're up to in this space. So like who you are as a reader, what reading is, etc. Okay, so for a little bit more about positioning theory, I included this link. So Ram Hare is one of the main scholars that uses this. You'll have the link so you can read more about it. I think I've given you enough of a gist to kind of get started. But this is a nice little reference. So that's our conceptual framework. And now we're going to move back to research questions. So I sort of fuse my goals and my conceptual framework together, and I'm going to use a particular, like a specific place, participants, etc. Realist, like I don't need an instrument to measure it, and process, like it's not about how does X correlate with Y. That kind of question. How do mathematics teachers recognized as strong, culturally responsive educators in 4 southeastern U.S. high schools use language to position students? How do students and teachers in these contexts use language to construct academic identities? And just to be transparent, I jotted all this down in 10 minutes, just trying to think about a way to work with a data source I found that I thought might be useful for us. So in this study, I'm sharing the possible methods. So because the goal was to look at strong culturally responsive educators, The participant selection was by recommendation by principals and community members as strong culturally responsive educators. And I hypothetically chose 4 high school mathematics teachers in local high schools with strong representations in the school of students of color. The data sources would be ongoing classroom observations. So you can think about what types of observations would make sense, like what level of participation makes sense, how would my positionality, like in my case as a white middle class woman, and all the other perspectives I bring into the situation, how does that shape the kind of observation that would make sense? What should my focus be? If I want to do interviews, who should I interview, when, how, why? What kind of questions would I ask? And then documents, what would actually be of use? So there could be a lot of things that are interesting in a setting without being really of use in answering these research questions. So we want to try to narrow down and not collect everything in the world. So we're going to talk about next week a lot more on validity. I know that's a issue that some of you have really come back to, and I know it's complicated, especially in comparison to how we think about it in post-positivist and more quantitative studies. So think about, from your reading, what are some concrete strategies we could use that we could put in our proposal that would help us develop credibility and trustworthiness in our findings. And as your readings point out, it's not enough to just have some sort of boilerplate strategies. What else do we need to bring from like a human perspective and an interactional perspective to help us make sure our findings are credible? As I talked about today, I typically use a critical realist paradigm. And so let me zoom back out so you can see all of that together. Okay. So now I'm going to look at jotting field notes. Okay. So you're going to be watching a video. We're going to pretend that you're in a classroom actually taking field notes. And I just pulled out some threads from Merriam and Tisdale and a few other sources to remind you of some things to consider when you are jotting field notes. So obviously, the first one is pay attention. And that's harder than it might seem, especially when we've been trained to be distracted. Shift from wide angle to narrow angle lens, focusing on a specific person, interaction, activity, while mentally blocking out the others. So this is the example of the student that I called Victor. I zeroed in on him and really just watched what he was doing, and that helped me make sense of the bigger picture. And then I would zoom out and look more at the flow of the whole classroom and so on. Look for keywords in people's remarks that will stand out later. When you're in the field, concentrate in a conversation on the first and last remarks. That's going to help you remember the arc of the conversation and just remember more about what happened. And then you can do some of those sort of mental, mnemonic exercises to play back remarks in your mind during breaks and, times where you just have a chance to think. So I'm going to ask you to do 2-column field notes for this. And so that's typically we would draw a line down the center of the paper or make a table. And on the left-hand side, we use our descriptive language. So this is literal, concrete, you can point to it, you could hear it, 5 senses kind of notes. And you're going to be in shorthand because you're going to be writing as you observe, or when you can steal a moment in the hall, for example. Direct quotes are great. Here's a quote from Glesney in a chapter that I offered you, but it wasn't required, and it's very lovely. So if you're thinking about observation, I recommend it. She says, strive for accuracy, but avoid being judgmental. Make sure that your notes will enable you a year later to visualize the moment, the person, the setting, the day. Summarizing observations into succinct, abstract statements will not do the job. Check your field notes for vague adjectives like many or some, and replace them with more descriptive words like, a cup, 9, etc. Look for and replace those words with descriptive words that convey an evaluative, that look for and replace those with descriptions, words that convey an evaluative impression. So those words obscure rather than clarify. So if you find yourself writing, oh, she's a wonderful teacher, this is so mundane or boring or interesting, or this kid is doing nothing, or that student is nice or good. Replace that with what you actually can see and smell and hear and so on. Make note of the dialogue. Focus on words that are used a lot or that are only used in this setting, like special words for that setting. And those words can help you with forming interview questions. They also can turn into emic or in vivo codes and categories. So that's the left-hand column, just like, what do you see? Okay. And then along the way, you also want to have this right-hand column, which is going to help you move toward thick description. Thick description doesn't mean every little detail. You're not talking about like every little cilia on the hairs on someone's head or whatever. You're actually, it's more inferential, right? It's getting at those ideas like about feelings, your interpretations, the sort of intent and motive and those kinds of things that you're seeing in the scene. And as best you can, you're trying to keep those as close to emic as possible, right? You want to do your best to make sense of the scene through the participant's eyes, knowing that we can never be fully there. So on this side, you're going to put down your feelings, your initial interpretations, speculations, working hypotheses, hunches. What do you think is going on here? Wonderings. I often write questions in this side. It reminds me of this. Metaphors, makes me think of. And Glesney also quoted Margaret Mead's daughter, saying that Margaret always emphasized the importance of recording first impressions and saving those first few pages of notes instead of discarding them in the scorn of later sophistication. For the informed eye has its own blindness as it begins to take for granted things that were initially bizarre. When something occurs to you, write it down, she said. So even if it's a feeling like, I just don't like that guy, like write it down, because there's something going on there. And it's also part of surfacing your own positionality and biases, however you want to frame that. So if I recoil at some teacher that is part of the setting, then I need to notice how I'm going to interpret that person's actions and how I'm going to hear their words, and I need to try to figure out like what is going on with that. Okay, so here's your two columns. Now you're going to go to the teaching channel, and this is the link. When I first went there, I was able to just watch the video, but then it made me, after a while, register, but it said I could watch 3 for free. So hopefully this will work for everyone. And I'd like you to watch from minute 8:20 to 17 minutes. This is a very short observation, and you'll notice that even those 9 minutes, it's kind of exhausting. So I want you to try and watch it as though you were there, right? Which means you don't get to pause, you don't get to rewind, you just have to try to take field notes as it's going. You can decide whether to do it in a notebook or in your, like on your computer. That either way is fine. I think I pasted this from another slide. Okay, so you're going to watch this video and you're going to do your 2 columns, and take your time with that. Really do include some of these inferential pieces, and you can think about it through the positioning theory lens, but like we talked about in class, don't use that as a waffle iron. It's not a prison, it's a lens, right? So things might jump out at you about how people are positioned or how the act of engaging in math class, is framed. But other things will jump out as well. Okay, so another piece that's really important is that after you're in the field and you're taking these hurried, jotted field notes, it's really important to save time to write them up and flesh them out afterward. So don't call someone and tell them how your observation was. Obviously don't post about it on Facebook, but don't lose the sense of urgency where you've built up all this memory of what happened and there's no way you captured it all on paper. So take the time to really flesh it out and turn it into narrative, sort of like what Jessica was talking about, is these narratives become the data. These are your data if you're doing observation, right? So you're going to flesh those out, and sometimes people keep the two columns. Personally, when I'm fleshing them out, I'll sometimes put italics for the parts that are more interpretive as opposed to descriptive. So then from there, let's imagine that that's your first data source on this study. Then you think about what's the next thing I want to gather. So who in this setting would I want to interview? And from Weiss's terminology, what might my substantive frame be? What do I want to find out about here that's relevant to my research questions and also relevant to what I'm learning from my first observation? So you could I encourage you to try designing an interview protocol. What are you going to ask? You could go back to the Merriam and Tisdall chapter 3 on interviewing and look at those question types, or it's chapter 5. You could look at the question types activity that I offered as like a matching activity. Try to draft questions from those different perspectives. Which ones are going to be most of use here? How can you use emic language, that language from the actual participants, in your questions to help sort of connect with their thinking better? Okay, I think that one's that. So if you do all this, I really encourage you to please send me what you do. And if you send it to me, I'm going to assume that it's okay for me to use your field notes and upload them into NVivo, and then we can look at them and code from there. And I'm not going to, put them up there and criticize your field notes. I might say this might be more of an interpretive thing, so I might put it over here. But, this is not, you can feel hopefully confident and safe sharing with me and your colleagues and helping us learn together. Okay, I'm sure that was 3 minutes, so that's great. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you next week.